I have the easiest and the hardest job today, which is to keep everybody on time so that we can hear all of these great speakers. Ellen is a giant in her field, and unlike so many people, she is unafraid of other giants and asked them all to be with us today. The thought leaders and practitioners in this field are going to speak today. The first of those is Dr. Marvin Southard. He is a clinical psychologist who did his doctoral work at UCLA, and then he then joined the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health as director in 1998, having previously served in Kern County in the same capacity for 5 years. In his current role, Dr. Southard leads the largest public mental health system in the country, serving over 200,000 clients annually in one of the most ethnically diverse counties in the nation, with a budget over $1.9 million. He is a governing board member of the California Mental Health Directors Association and the president of the board of directors of the California Social Work Education Service. He serves as a commissioner in the Los Angeles County Children and Families First, and as a licensed clinical social worker, he has given most of his professional life to these issues. Doctor?
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking Ellen for the invitation to participate in today's event. There's only a few things I've done in my life that have impressed my kids, and being invited by Ellen to participate is one of those few things. So, Maureen, thank you for the kind introduction. One of the things that Maureen didn't say about my career and past that only a few of my close friends know is that my undergraduate degree is in philosophy. And there are some friends who say I've never quite recovered from that. The title of my topic today, the Correcting Category Errors as a Foundation for Decriminalizing Mental Illness, is a reflection of that early interest in philosophy. And so in preparing for today's event, I decided to do what all modern philosophers do to prepare and do research, which is I consulted Wikipedia. So Wikipedia, well, first of all, when I was in school, they also taught me that when I'm giving an important address, I should tell my audience what I'm going to say, and then I should say it, and then when I'm done, I should tell them what I told them. And I thought, isn't that kind of what a lawyer does in a trial? They tell the jury what they're going to say, then they give the evidence, and then they sum up. So in a way, this is my touch of legal intervention here today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe what a category error is, what that concept means, and give you a couple of examples. I'm going to tell you why I believe correcting the category errors is important for today's conversation. Then I'm going to describe 5 categories of behavior that get confused in this conversation about mental illness. Now, I'm going to give you 5 categories, but I'm only going to talk about 3 of those. And then when I'm done with that, I will give you some implications that I believe are important for our practice here together. So first, what is a category error? According to Wikipedia, oh, and by the way, Wikipedia is really interesting in this regard because I consulted it 3 times in the process of preparing, and the page was different each time I prepared it. So according to Wikipedia, a category error is a semantic or ontological mistake in which one kind of thing is taken or presented as though it belonged to another. So that's kind of complicated. But luckily, they give examples. So an example, I'll give you two. One example of a category error is where somebody might say, "Your tie, Dr. Southard, it just screams that you need attention." Or somebody might say, "Dr. Southard, your tie really tells me that your wife spares no expense and has great taste." So you could have an argument about which one of those statements is true, but a category error would be to say, "Dr. Southard, what language is your tie speaking? Is it speaking in Spanish or English, or is it speaking loud or softly?" So category error can be the confusion of language that is meant to be metaphorical and taking it as though it were literal. That's one kind of a category error. Another example that they give has to do with team spirit. So since we're here at USC, let's say somebody visiting from another country went to the Galen Center and they know that team spirit is an important part of any winning tradition. So they go, they take a tour, they look at the basketball courts, they see the equipment, they meet the players, and they say, "Well, where do you keep your team spirit?" And the answer is, well, team spirit isn't a physical thing that you keep in a place. It belongs to a different kind of category. So it seems to me that these kind of category errors are the things that happen to us in discussions about mental illness and criminalization. Why is this important for today's conversation? I think it's important for today's conversation because I believe these kinds of category errors impede problem solving, confuse the dialogue, and create false public impressions. And all three of these things prevent us from doing things for people with mental illness, the things that could be done to prevent them from being criminalized. So just to explain why I believe this is not a theoretical problem, but an actual problem, I'll give three examples. First, when I was first here in Los Angeles County in 1998, I went to a public event, and there at the public event was an advocate, and this advocate had the best heart possible. But one of the things that she said was that every child in juvenile halls and juvenile camps needs mental health treatment. And the reason we know that is because if they didn't have a mental illness, then they wouldn't have committed the deed that got them into juvenile hall or juvenile camp. So it could be true, as a factual matter, that every kid in juvenile hall or juvenile probation needs mental health treatment, but it's a category error to assert that somebody is in juvenile hall or is mentally ill because they had a bad behavior. So there was a false equation between bad behavior and mental illness, and that kind of a category error is the sort of thing that permeates our public discussion. Second category example, and Ellen referred to this in her opening statement. So there are prominent law enforcement officials that assert that their county jails are the largest mental health treatment facilities of their kind, for example. And I believe that that is essentially a category error because there are some people who are in jail because of behaviors that stem from their mental illness, but there are other people who are in jail who happen to have a mental illness and their crime had nothing to do with their mental illness. And there are some people who are in jail who developed a mental illness because of the stresses of being in jail. So collapsing all of those into one thing is misleading. It's also misleading because the jail mental health system in LA County, for example, right now serves about 18,000 people. About the mental health treatment population there is about 1,800 people. It's about 10% of the population. Everyone who comes into jail is screened for mental illness. So the treatment penetration is fairly high, and the actual incidence of mental illness in the general population approximates 10%. So it would be like saying New York is the place that has the highest incidence of mental illness per square mile because there's more people there. Where you have more people, you will have more people with mental illness just because you have more people. So the discussion then, and why is that important? It's important because when we start talking about solutions, what will make mental health treatment in jails or treatment facilities better than it is now, if we conflate everything together, it's harder to arrive at the proper solution. Third reason that these category errors are problematic has to do with the way that we use language. And this is a larger issue than I think I can address today, but you know, we talk about insane ideas, crazy plans, lunatic political schemes. So we have used these words, crazy, insane, lunatic, to mean I don't like it, I don't agree with it, it's different from the way I think. And so we are using those words that are referring, and the public takes to be referring to mental illness for a variety of negative things that essentially mean I don't like it. So this undisciplined use of language, I think, ends up having an effect on the public discourse when we deal with things like mental illness. So then I'll talk about the 5 categories. So I'm going to ask you to imagine 5 circles. The first circle are those behaviors that emanate directly from a mental illness and cause somebody to be in the criminal justice system one way or another. And this first circle is the one that I'll spend most of the time talking about. Then the second circle is one where somebody has criminal behaviors that emanate from bad decisions. So people make a bad decision, somebody could happen to you or I. We're driving, we hit somebody. That's an accident. The decision to run is what makes it a crime, and that is the bad decision. We may have a mental illness, we may not have a mental illness, but the bad decision is what caused that action to be a crime. That's the second category. The third category are those actions that emanate from a substance abuse problem where the issues related to the behavior happen under the influence of alcohol and drugs. So those behaviors obviously, that circle obviously overlaps with the first circle because many of the people who have mental illness also have a problem with alcohol and drugs, but not all. And it also interacts with the second circle because all of us know that alcohol and drugs very often contribute to bad decisions. But the problem exists, well, then I'll talk about the 2 circles that I'm not going to spend time on. The fourth circle I'll call moral evil, and that has to do with those actions that result from decisions that are just morally evil. So the reason I'm not going to talk about that is I only have a bachelor's degree in philosophy, and dealing with the problem of evil takes a PhD. So then the 5th circle is one that's come up just recently in a very large way for the public mental health system, which are those behaviors that emanate from a brain lesion that has not historically been defined as a mental illness. Traumatic brain injury, concussion, dementia, those individuals haven't typically been defined as mental illness, and that's going to be a huge new problem for the public mental health system, but I'm going to leave that aside for today. For today, I'm going to talk about the three behavior circles that I spoke about. Those behaviors that emanate directly from a mental illness and get criminalized, those behaviors that come from bad decisions, and those behaviors that come from substance abuse problems. So the issue that we have that creates the category errors are that many times those three circles are conflated as though they were all the same thing. And if they're conflated as though they're the same thing, it's really difficult to figure out what the interventions ought to be, what the prevention strategies ought to be, how we as a society ought to deal with them. So examples. The first circle. This is the one that I think most of us were thinking about today. And I can use three examples that come to my mind. First, last time I was at Twin Towers doing a visit, there was an individual there who was in high observation housing. The reason he was in high observation housing was that he still, after some amount of time, was still psychotic. His crime I asked about, he went into a 7-Eleven, popped a Monster drink, and opened some chips. And so he was arrested for that. If he had not had a mental illness, he probably would have been cited and released. But because he was psychotic, he couldn't just be cited and released. He was processed through the system and ended up with a significant amount of time being treated in high observation housing that probably wouldn't have taken place had he not had a mental illness. Another example has to do with a family friend from when I was in Kern County, a little kid I saw growing up who developed schizophrenia in his early 20s. This kid was a very shy kid who never got the self-confidence to learn how to drive, but he was from a Latino background, and in his community, he took on the demeanor as though he was a tough gang guy. The truth is that the worst thing he ever did was spray paint a Taco Bell, but he got picked up for a variety of things in the company of people who were willing to blame him for what they had been doing. When I tried to, as a family friend, reach out to the legal system, the judge's opinion is that he did not want any mental health advice on how to handle his case. This was not in LA County. So, so that individual ended up getting enough strikes to do time in Wasco in the intensive treatment unit. A kid who had really never done any serious harm at all. Third example is my wife was the homeless outreach coordinator for another county, and in that time she served an individual who was mentally ill and wouldn't eat. So he lost so much weight that when he would pick up his bedroll at the end of the night, his pants would fall down. The lady across the street thought she was being mooned. He was picked up for sex offenses as a result of that, and it took years of work to have those offenses taken off his record so he could get housing and treatment in the way that he needed to. Those are all examples where people's behavior got criminalized simply because they were suffering from a mental illness. The second category are those people whose behavior is criminalized, but it really comes from bad decisions. And some of those, as I said before, happen to have a mental illness. So there are people with mental illnesses in Twin Towers, but who, or in the treatment system, but whose crime really does not have to do with their mental illness. And those individuals present treatment challenges, but they don't present the same intervention challenges as the first group. If we treat those two groups as though they were exactly the same, I think we fail both groups. Third category, and this in some ways is the thing that I think as a society we neglect the most, which are those behaviors that emanate from substance use and then end up getting criminalized in increasingly intense ways. So in the AB 109 population here in Los Angeles County, more than 80% of the AB 109 non-sexual, non-violent, non-serious offenders have an addiction disorder. And yet the ability to intervene and provide treatment is much smaller than it needs to be. As we're designing systems that address the criminalization of our populations, particularly the criminalization of some ethnic communities, I think we need to focus on our approach to substance use disorders and how those substance use disorders interact with the first category, with people who have a mental illness. Because, as I'm sure everyone here knows, mentally ill people do not present any more risk of violence than anyone else unless they also have a concurrent substance abuse disorder. So the biggest problems that we have with mental illness and violence aren't really due to mental illness. They're due to the combination of mental illness and substance abuse disorders. So what are the implications for practice? I think the implications for practice for us are these. I think that we need to, and I'll talk about implications for practice for prevention, implications for practice for early intervention, implications for practice for treatment in those populations that we are already serving for treatment purposes. Implications for practice for prevention. As we develop in our communities ways of approaching reducing the criminalization of our people, we need to develop prevention strategies that are different, targeting populations 1, 2, and 3. So the prevention strategy that we employ for folks who are suffering for a serious and persistent mental illness have to do with what we can do to affect robust housing, full-service partnership programs, whatever it takes programs, aggressive outreach, so that we provide those individuals with the services and supports that they need so that they are not in homeless and other contexts where they are likely to be arrested and become criminalized and end up in the position that I described those three individuals with whom I'm familiar. And we know what to do. We know how to do that work. We just need to focus on how that gets done. For the number 2 population, for those individuals who don't have a serious and persistent mental illness as the cause of their behaviors, but bad decisions, but may also have a mental illness, in those instances, I think the area of focus ought to be our intervention with trauma. Because one of the things that we know is that when people in communities experience trauma and that trauma goes untreated, we can be sure that the life outcomes for those individuals, whether they experience trauma or just witness trauma, are worse than they are for individuals who are not experiencing or witnessing trauma. Once again, we know what to do. We know that we can go into communities. We can build intervention systems whereby the community itself provides mental health first aid and other interventions so that people who experience trauma don't have to feel the full effects of trauma in their life. So we know that works. We just need to do it and bring it up to scale. The third category. In the third category, I believe we need to do two things. We need to find ways for early intervention, particularly with adolescents, in the arena of individuals with anxiety and depression, because anxiety and depression are the threshold for substance use disorders for adolescents. Many times the substance use disorder problem for adolescents is really mediated by social anxiety, where the kids don't know exactly what it is that they are doing with themselves, and so the thing to do ends up being experimenting with alcohol and drugs. That experimentation feels as though it works for a little while, but in the long run it proves to be exactly the worst thing they can do precisely for their depression and their anxiety, and it leads to an addictive process that can end up lasting throughout their lives. That is a process that we have not invested enough in. Particularly, we have not invested enough in that work for our child welfare and foster care populations where the risks are highest. So the substance abuse prevention work is something that we know that we can do much better than we currently do. I think the biggest effects that we can end up having have to do with a public discourse that keeps us from making all three of these important categories, behaviors that emanate from mental illness, behaviors that emanate from bad decisions, and behaviors that emanate from substance abuse, be taken by the public as though they were exactly the same thing. And the stigma of lumping all of that together as a part of mental illness is, I think, one of the things that prevents people from getting the treatment they need, and particularly keeps ethnic communities away from wanting to seek treatment in the way that we ought to be able to provide treatment. So my hope for us today is that as we have this dialogue and look at what we want to do to prevent people from, with mental illness from being criminalized and being treated in ways that are not correct, that we exercise our mental discipline to think of what category of behavior we're talking about when we're proposing an intervention. If we're looking at a diversion program, what diversion program is the diversion program aimed at all three of those categories? What particular category? How do we approach it? Because if we lump everything together, we don't serve our public well. So in conclusion, I would just like to say that I hope we have some time for dialogue, because these issues that I've been thinking about how to avoid these category errors, are the beginning of a conversation. I think there's more conceptual work that we need to do. But the one thing that I do know for sure is that the dialogue that has generally taken place has not been a dialogue that has served persons with mental illness. The conflation of issues of gun violence and mental illness in the way that's been happening recently, I don't believe has served people with mental illness well. Thank you very much. My recollection of the data is that it is more, although it's also true that the general population, as they use substances, are much higher risk for violence also. But just the additive effect of mental illness and substances is more than it is for the general population.
I would debate your assumption that that LA, the Twin Towers, is described as the largest mental hospital in the country because of the number of people there. Tom Hamilton, a member of NAMI, did a statistic outcome of the closing of state hospitals and said the number of people in the state hospital went down and an equal amount of patients went up in terms of the jail system. And so I would question your concept that the reason for this is because of the number of people in the jail, because I would propose that perhaps the number of people in the jail is because we don't have state hospitals or we don't have the mental health facilities available.
That is the debate. In my view, right now there are, 360 people in high observation housing within the within Twin Towers. So and there are 26 people in the forensic inpatient program because that's the number of beds they are. They're always full. So the actual number of high intensity treatment individuals is within the LA County jail system is relatively small given the overall population and much smaller than the reduction in number of state hospital beds generally. So if LA County is a third of the state, then anyway, I guess people could have people of goodwill could have different interpretations of that data, but that's I just want to say that's not necessarily the interpretation that everybody has.
Yes. Excuse me. I think there's a fourth category of people that we don't like to talk about. These are the people in jail who falsely claim mental illness. These are the people who receive SSI for a disability of mental illness that use the SSI as their goal in life to perpetuate their substance abuse. And these are the people that take our limited resources and make it very difficult to separate out those who really have legitimate mental illness and require legitimate treatment with those that are just malingering and faking it for the secondary gain. I think it's a huge problem that's not adequately addressed.
Well, I know that does happen from time to time. When I once visited Wasco State Prison, which was a mental health treatment prison there, and I was being given a tour by the psychiatrist, and this desperate prisoner came up to me and said, Doc, you got to get me out of here. And his story was he thought that the mental health facility at Wasco would be a easier place to be than the general population. But once he was there, he found out, no, you have less privileges, you don't get visitors as much. So he desperately wanted to be reassessed so he could unconfabulate and be readmitted to the general population. And the psychiatrist said, no, this was a number of years ago, we've got a 4-month waiting list for psych visits, so you're going to have to stay. So he thought he didn't know I wasn't the right kind of doctor for him, but he wanted to get out. So it does happen occasionally, but I think if there are two problems, people who have a mental illness trying to pretend that they don't have a mental illness, that is a much bigger weight than people who don't have a mental illness pretending that they do have it. And we have clinics where people do try to pretend that they have symptoms, but it's a relatively small part of the population in our experience.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So thanks so much for bringing up the language issue. And my work is centered around this whole idea of, are people evil or not? So I'm a little bit concerned about that statement that, you know, people are just morally evil, and especially without a lot to talk about or back it up. So can you talk a little bit, you made that, you know, about not having a PhD, so you didn't want to say much about it, but could you talk a little bit about that group that's just, that you think is morally evil?
So I don't necessarily think people, well, you know, I had, as I've talked to my wife and other people about this, we had some debate about that category. And as I had debate, I thought, well, Hitler is an example. You know, he may have suffered from a mental illness. I think he was also morally evil. There are some people who exhibit some kinds of behavior that I think are morally evil. But as I say, that's probably a different conversation from a legal conversation or even a mental health conversation. But as a person, I believe evil exists. I don't necessarily believe that everyone has to share that issue. That's just my personal viewpoint.
But in terms of our legal system, I mean, if we have this notion that people are just evil, then we can punish them. I mean, there's a huge implication from the top down. So it's kind of a big statement to be making.
So I think in our legal system, what we need is a mens rea, a guilty mind, some sense that people are doing something wrong, but it's the behavior and not the person that has broken the law. And some laws are not necessarily, so I think this is another category error kind of discussion, because there are some legal things that don't necessarily have a moral implication. There are other things that do have a moral implication, but different people and different societies have different moral codes, and that's where it becomes complicated. And I didn't finish my PhD, so.
Well, we could talk about this all day, but
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a comment or a question about the gentleman you said that was incarcerated, still suffering the symptoms of psychosis, so he was continued to be held incarcerated rather than released. And you said if he was, you know, didn't have the mental illness, he probably would have been released. So if someone is suffering the symptoms of psychosis, why wouldn't they release him to a subacute facility for ongoing medical care versus, is it the infrastructure problem again? We don't have the beds in subacute, because it seems kind of discriminatory to leave somebody who would have been released incarcerated where they get, my opinion, substandard medical treatment for their psychosis.
Well, so I can't tell you on that particular case because it was just a short anecdote as I was doing the tour, so I can't tell you the legal specifics.
We do see people kept incarcerated who have psychosis longer than another person. Right,
and sometimes it has to do with establishing competencies. I'm not competent to say that word. So competency to stand trial, and so sometimes that process ends up having people spending more time establishing their ability to be tried properly rather than they would have served.
Yeah, you can release them because they come back from subacutes back to trial. I mean, you know what I'm saying? They go back, they go to a subacute facility and they do get transported back for their judicial. We see that, you know. So I don't know. I see Mr. Mayberg, Dr. Mayberg shaking his head, but.
So again, I don't know the specifics. I think the point you're raising is really the point I was trying to make, is that we ought to have, and if we had clearer concept of what we were doing, we would have better avenues for routing people to the treatment that they need rather than criminalizing behavior that in ordinary circumstances is trivial, and particularly in that particular instance, so for example, some jurisdictions have a pre-arrest diversion, so the arresting officer has the ability, with the permission of the DA, to take people to a treatment facility and not arrest them, and then saving the whole system, the booking, all of that kind of stuff. And if the person chooses to be in treatment, that's the end of it. They don't have an arrest or anything. If they don't, they could, if they choose not to do that, they could be arrested. So the diversion from, the diversion can happen in a variety of places. And the point I'm trying to make is, if we're clearer about what category of person we're dealing with, we can devise a diversion system that makes more sense to actually achieve the goals that we're trying to accomplish. If we mush everything together, then we will end up diverting some people that probably shouldn't be diverted, and other people will end up in treatment for psychosis in jail when they could get better treatment on the outside.
I only minored in philosophy, so I'm really struggling here. But if you could speak just somewhat on I work in juvenile justice in the probation camps, and a lot of the issues we run into is the diagnosis. So if you could just say something on the DSM-4 and then soon to be DSM-5, and do you think the issue could be diagnostic? I mean, is it the category may be overused or maybe not specific enough to the minors that we're seeing? Do you have any thoughts on just, is it possibly a diagnostic issue here? Is that clear?
No, I'm not sure what a diagnostic issue is.
Are we over-diagnosing some of the minors that we run across? And is that then a problem of the DSM that the category may be too broad?
Yeah, I think...
like conduct disorder?
Yeah. So I think the issue is probably... if we focus more on anxiety, depression, and diagnoses like that, and focused on the evidence-based treatments that focus on those things, and less on like conduct disorders and things that are moving in the direction, if they were an adult, would be antisocial personality disorder and those kind of behaviors, I think we would do better in our treatment outcomes than we currently do, because some of the behaviors that look like conduct disorders are probably the byproducts of the system that the kid finds himself in. So you act in certain ways to survive in an environment that calls forth certain kinds of activities, which has been one of the criticisms of the juvenile justice system overall. So I think you're onto something about how we do a better job, even diagnostically, with this category error issue.
Yeah, like growing up in South Central, then you could end up with a whole bunch of minors with conduct disorder, but it's their environment, so that helps. Thank you.
Yeah, as a follow-up to this diagnostic issue, one thing I was kind of surprised you didn't touch on, but there were many things to touch on, is the chronic and gross overdiagnosis of African Americans who actually have mood disorders with a schizophrenic disorder. And if you want to talk about a category of error that affects us on a day-to-day basis, this is, I think, one of the elephants in the room. And it's gotten to the point where, when I'm at UCLA, I remember there were like multiple PhD honor projects about just this sort of thing, where they would take, the exact same kind of fictitious patient, show the psychiatrist, but one of the patients would be Caucasian and one would be African American, and it's horribly skewed. In terms of being poor and African American is almost seemingly one of the criteria for being misdiagnosed as schizophrenia. And so, if we're talking about categories of error, is part of it the very way that we approach what our sense of pathology is and how it's integrated with the racist problems, not outside of the system that we're attempting to treat, but the racist issues within the system itself in terms of the diagnosis of clinicians.
Yeah, and I think that's an important problem, and then there are other diagnostic issues that we need to pay attention to as well. So, for example, one of the things I did with the health director a few health directors ago was to take a look at the top 100 high-cost individuals in the public system, in the health department, the mental health department. We didn't have substance abuse data, so we couldn't use that. We looked at the top 100. In those top 100, they were virtually all mentally ill, and the diagnoses were, so sometimes these people would be in a different emergency room, 3 different emergency rooms in the same week, or multiple emergency rooms, but the admitting diagnosis might be bipolar one time, schizophrenia the next time, schizophreniform the next time. They're all different, and the complicating factor that was also what I was trying to allude to was that virtually all of them also had substances on board. These top 100 had substances on board that were, as they presented in the emergency rooms, further complicating the diagnostic picture, which it doesn't speak to what you were bringing up, but is a different kind of complication for the diagnostic value of what we do. And sometimes, you know, I think you're exactly right. Sometimes misdiagnosis ends up creating lessened life chances for individuals who receive that diagnosis.
Especially when they don't have, especially when they have faith in what's going on. You know, if you're told you're schizophrenic, you know, by multiple, you know, psychiatrists, social workers, psychologists, and you're medicated that way, and all of your focus of treatment is in that direction, you're going to start believing it. You know, you become almost a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, especially if you don't have schizophrenia and the medications you give you side effects that affect your lives in negative ways, that's a problem.
We're rubber stamping people constantly. When I enter into Twin Towers, everybody has psychotic disorder, NOS, stamp. I work at Downtown Mental Health, everybody has major depressive disorder, 29634, stamp. And the people that I used to see at Twin Towers that I now see by coincidence at Downtown Mental Health, it's the same people, same issues, same presentation from a couple of years ago, different diagnoses, because they switched where they are. Yeah, and this is just what we're doing. We give them 29634 because we'll get SSI. We give them psychotic disorder NOS because it's a 90-day sentence for, you know, the fact that they didn't see the PO, you know, by 45 minutes of lateness, so they have a 90-day sentence again. So we may as well give them an NOS so that way the rule out is okay. You know, there's a lot of into this that's based on our lack of care because of our own. And I'm going to stop.